discussion formation in this ongoing project that I mentioned earlier that involves several of us.
Yeah. First, we would like to thank Mike for organizing this and inviting us. And as Mike said, this is the result of a joint effort. About 100 Skype meetings, I think, we have had on this topic, where we have read a lot of conversation analysis and discussed it, and read transcripts and discussed especially what we came to call the epistemic program.
So we have handouts, they don't have to turn around. Some of this is sort of long quotes which are difficult to catch. What we would like to do is to start with a point, a comment that was made by Garfinkel in connection to some we made a series of seminars in Boston in 1975, and there we talked of the enterprise of a group of people, including Saxon himself, which to study the in situ production of ordinary action. And he saw two currents coming from this early initiative. In one, the ensuing studies were by and large conserving and extending the original program, this radical program as it was first articulated. But in the other current, there would be what he talks of as a rival version, studies that build on showing that the early work sort of developing it in ways that showed how it was erroneous or have missed something. So I'm going to try to play the clip.
Now, it was since 1967 that the ethnographers clear have been preoccupied with this in situ production of the structures of ordinary action. Those studies were initiated by a few people. Sachs, Shedlaw, Sutno, Edwin, and me. Two currents come from those initiatives. In one of the currents, the early initiatives are pretty well preserved and extended. In the second current, the early initiatives then provide motives for rival versions of the in situ production. And those rival versions get developed in original directions. Whether the ensuing studies are conservative of these early initiatives, or whether they develop them to provide for the in situ production as an object having been missed essentially in the early initiatives, and thereby subsequent work does more than merely correct by adding to things otherwise not known in the early work. Instead, that it finds that the early work was in the beginning erroneous and needs to be put together differently in the first place. That's the import of a rival version.
So the question that we want to pose here is if it's reasonable to depict one of these later developments in conversation analysis, which we call the epistemic program, as such a rival version. And we will focus mainly on this paper, the epistemics in action, and the model that it prescribes for understanding social actions. And as you may know, this has become the most read paper of Roll C, and it's widely cited across the field. So it's one of the reasons we focus so much on it. And a couple of years ago, this paper received the Best Paper Award from the ASA Section 43. And we would like to point to the explanatory statement for the award in order to highlight some central features. And we find it sort of significant that it is both portrayed as redefining and reasserting SAC's original program. And I think at this formulation alone, there is at least some recognition at the general level of the paper, Epistemics in Action, as a rival version in Garfunkel's sense of the term. And second, there is the claim that CA has missed out on some of the radical implications of the original program. And this is interesting in relation to the topic of our discussion here. And it could also be seen as very much of a critique of not only later day CA, but also of the works of Schegloff and others. And the question, so the argument is that this question of how turns at talk are designed and produced so to be recognizable as actions of a particular kind, this question has been neglected. So this is no minor topic, and it was a question that was most central to SAC's project. So when heritage is said to be challenging conventional thinking in CA, one could take that to signify a return to the radical roots. But then again, we also get a bit confounded when we also hear that it's hinting at a future engagement with reductionist account of neuroscience. So in our view, the production and recognition of social actions has been a central topic within conversation analysis from the time of SAC's early lectures. But nevertheless, sort of recently there has been a complaint here. And the argument is that CA has not yet sufficiently dealt with the question of how an action is built to provide for its recognizability. And this later topic has become sort of labeled as action formation. And heritage argues not only that there have been too few studies on the topic, but also that CA has been unable to provide systematic analysis of action formation. And this critique mainly is sort of applied to how CA approached first or sequence initiating actions by taking into account how these play out sequentially, and thus how they are treated by parties to the conversation. But according to Heritage, and I will quote, to understand the underlying mechanics of first actions, next turn will not always be a source of unequivocal validation. It and the other resources of sequential analysis will certainly help us understand that a prior turn was or was not understood as a request for information, but it may be less informative about how that came to be the case, end of quote. So the argument is not only that next actions are unable to illuminate how prior actions are understood, but that the resources of sequential analysis in general have little bearing on what is here called the underlying mechanics of first action. And when the problem is framed in this way, it's not only in the sense of sequence initiate actions, they are treated as firsts, not just as first parts of a two-part pair, but also as first in relation to something coming before. So the formulation of the problem is downplaying the relevance of both prior and next actions. And co-participants, as well as overhearing analysts, seem to be left with single turns at talk and their composition. And when you sort of disqualify the resources of sequential analysis, you also reintroduce the problem that previously confronted speech theorists and other students of language. So, Heritage points out that the composition of turns, single turns, is not sufficient for understanding what those turns are doing in a particular interaction. And he focuses the discussion on utterances that act as requests for information. And it builds on previous studies that have shown that utterances with an interrogative form do not necessarily function as questions, and that utterances with syntactic forms other than interrogative frequently do serve as questions. And given this lack of determinate relation between form and of an utterance and its interactional function, he asks, how do utterances function as requests for information? And to put it simply, the proposed answer to this question can be found in a list with so-called list of 3 primary elements. It's morphosyntax, its intonation, and its epistemic domain. And only, according to our argument, when epistemic domain or epistemic status is introduced, are speakers and recipients equipped with the resources necessary for producing and recognizing first actions. Otherwise, those actions would remain ambiguous. So we can note that sequentiality and other potential resources seem to be taken out of the picture here. Not only in the formulation of the problem, but also in the proposed solution. But this question, so how are the practices of talk and other conduct fashioned into recognizable actions, and how a given action is recognized as such by recipients by virtue of the practices that produced it, this is a question that has been addressed before. And in Sheglov's characterization of the action formation problem, he speaks of the composition of action and the constituent parts and the arrangements, and he says that these parts are drawn from the pool of available resources, in which he lists language, the body, the environment of the interaction, the position in the interaction. And the idea here is that combinations yield particular recognizable social actions. And one can criticize this view, but if we compare it to heritage, more trimmed version, the sequential environment of the utterance is removed, and there is only syntax and intonation considered. And given these circumstances, any utterance is in principle ambiguous with regards to the action it is performing. And it is therefore, as a disambiguator, that epistemic status becomes necessary. But our argument is that this ambiguity is what Sheglov calls a theoretical ambiguity. That is derived at by procedures that are not relevant to naturally occurring interaction. And in natural context, those ambiguities are not there to begin with. So the concept of epistemic status builds on an idea that relative epistemic access to a domain is stratified between two speakers, A and B, and such that they occupy different position on an epistemic gradient. And the speakers are positioned as being more knowledgeable, or sometimes designated as K+, or less knowledgeable, K-, about a specific domain in question. And this relative positioning, which is referred to as epistemic status. And it's claimed that epistemic status involves the parties' joint recognition of their comparative access, knowledgeability, rights relative to some domain of knowledge, which means then that the recognition of social action now has come to rely on the recognizability of relative knowledge. So in this view, in order to recognize a question as a question, it's necessary to recognize the relevant distribution, the access, entitlements, rights, responsibilities in relation to the knowledge involved. And it's not that these questions are just occasionally relevant. According to heritage, interactants must at all times be cognizant of what they take to be the real world distribution of knowledge and of rights to knowledge between them as a condition of correctly understanding how clausal utterances are to be interpreted as social actions. And we think these are very bold claims, and they raise a number of questions. So if interactants have to keep track of epistemic status at all times, how do they do that? How can they keep track of the relevant distribution, access, entitlements, rights, responsibilities, and so on? And also, how can a conversation analyst gain access to this supposedly constant orientation to the real-world distribution of knowledge, and to show that it is demonstrably relevant and procedurally consequential to the parties on the occasion of the evaluation. Towards the end of the paper in Rolsey, there is a summary of the program or the ideas in this table. And what we see here is sort of in the left-hand column, there are features which could be read off single utterances. So it's declarative syntax with final rising intonation and so on. And the other two columns are, they list different types of actions. Sort of what participants in a setting would recognize an utterance to be doing given, and I quote, the known in common epistemic status of a speaker and a recipient relative to the targeted state of affairs. End of quote. So one can note that the column doesn't simply state that whether an utterance is giving or requesting information. We can also find more specified types of action, such as informing, continuing, questioning, asserting information, and so on. And we think a table like this could be read in two different ways. So if we only look at the table without reading the accompanying article, one could understand it as a table of co-occurrence. So something that starts with recognizable actions and then shows some sort of conceptual link that asserting information, almost by definition, implies that the issue is within the speaker's domain, whereas requesting information means that the issue is not primarily in the domain of the speaker. But when you look at the whole argument, this is not the way in which the table is presented. And the argument is that epistemic status drives, it shapes, it forms the production of and recognition of actions.
So, Jonas gave an outline and raised some conceptual issues tied to the epistemic program, but in our weekly Skype meetings, most of the discussions have been tied to particular transcript and the interpretation of transcript, and also a heritage text is mostly consists mostly of transcripts and commentaries to these transcripts. And heritage argument is not that it's sometimes reasonable to take epistemic issues into account. Instead, he makes a much stronger claim and maintains that he offers evidence that epistemic status is fundamental in determining that actions are or are not requests for information. So a central question for us is whether his demonstrations really show that epistemic status is necessary or fundamental. And given the claim that epistemic status constitutes an unavoidable element of action information, it should perhaps be relatively easy to come up with clear demonstrations. But when looking at 30 fragments used as evidence, it is in each and every case possible to come up with compelling accounts of how the parties understand these actions without reference to epistemic status. And I will just point to a couple of fragments as example. This first fragment is taken from a telephone conversation between Jenny and Ida. It is presented by Heritage as an example of a declarative utterance that is congruent with the speaker's epistemic status. The things talked about are within the speaker's epistemic domain, so that the target utterance here, the things that derived from Barker and Stonehouse in line 8, is heard as informing. Here you can note that the phrase is preceded by line 7's "I've just trying to tell you." So while it's clear that the utterance is informing rather than asking, an analysis that includes the first part of the utterance has little use of epistemic status as a disambiguative. And given that an account of the term's recognizability can be constructed without reference to epistemic matters, the fragment fails to demonstrate the necessity of epistemic status. One could perhaps argue that Jenny used the talk in line 7 to infer that Ida is in K+ position, and then uses that inference to conclude that line 8 is a telling and not a question. But to us, this seems to introduce both unnecessary and problematic steps. And this second fragment is taken from a medical interview. Here, Heritage treats the doctor, "You're divorced currently," as information seeking by virtue of the epistemic domains in play. It is stated that the doctor relies upon the patient's authoritative information. But for us, there is little reason to treat utterance on line 5 as a first action, whose sense is independent of its sequential history. The target turn is part of a medical case history, where the doctor goes through a series of predefined items on the questionnaire. So although it seems reasonable to say that the doctor is less knowledgeable than his patient about her marital status, this does not mean that the recollection of relative knowledge is necessary, a necessary condition for hearing the utterance as a question. In fact, Heritage himself provides an alternative reading of the target utterance, calling it the next best guess that is prompted by the patient's response to the prior, "Are you married?" With these first two examples, we have tried to show that the kind of evidence that Heritage put forward for his model is unconvincing. The ambiguities that epistemic status are brought to address are theoretical ambiguities, not ambiguities that actually show up in the interaction. But our problem is not only that the epistemic model is unnecessary or redundant. In many cases, we also believe that it results in skewed or reductionist accounts that overlooks the manifest orientations of the members. And this can be used as an example of that. It's a fragment taken from a telephone conversation between Debbie and Shelley. And the two friends had planned to go to a trip together. Shelley had then cancelled the trip, and Debbie now accuses Shelley for having done this because her boyfriend is not going, and more generally, that Shelley routinely abandons her girlfriends in favor of guys. The target turn, Shelley, so and when other times have I ever done that, is thus responsive to this accusation. And I see if I can play this.
So, I mean, it's not because it's not because he's not going, it's because his money's not funding me.
Okay.
So, and one other time have I ever done
Well,
that?
I'm just saying, it just seems like you base a lot of things on guys. I don't know. It just, a couple times, I don't, it's not a big deal.
Here, the assignment of Shelley's K+ position is the anchor point of Heritage analysis. And from this, he makes a number of inferences about what Shelley is doing. Most centrally, he maintains, and I quote, that the K+ position cancels the possibility that the target utterance will be heard as requesting information. He then writes, whatever the action that is derived from this utterance, challenge, complaint, protest, rebuttal, it does not embrace requesting information. Thus, even if Shelley's interlocutor had responded by listing occasions in which Shelley had abandoned girlfriends for guys, a course of action she does not undertake here, we would be justified in viewing this eventuality as the subversion of Shelley's objective in producing the utterance, a case of her being hoist on her own petard. And all these observations seem to emerge from the ascription of Shelley's K+ position to an utterance with an interrogative syntax. But for us, it's not clear why Shelley would be more knowledgeable on the matter of being a bad friend than her friend Debbie. Isn't the disputable access to such matters exactly the kind of stuff that challenges like these are centered on? Neither is it clear why it would be unreasonable to hear the target utterance as a question in search for information. Shelley is the person who's being accused, and the general accusation that she regularly let her girlfriends down remained in play even after she attempted to explain why she cancelled the trip. Wouldn't it therefore be reasonable for Shelley to seek information about other times she had let her girlfriends down, so that she could excuse or explain herself? In fact, in relation to each and every claim that Heritage makes about this instance, it's possible to make the case for the opposite position, that Shelley in fact does not have privileged access to the domain, that her question requests information, or at least an account, that it's not a rhetorical question, and that listening occasions in which Shelley had abandoned girlfriends wouldn't be a subversion of Shelley's objective in producing the utterance. And besides being reasonable, we believe that our alternative reading of the fragment and the target utterance better captures the demonstrable orientations of the two parties. Just after the fragment that Heritage presents, after Debbie has replied without specifying other occasions, Shelley produces some candidate instances herself, and I will just play first.
So, and one other time have I ever done
Well, I'm
that?
just saying, it just seems like you base a lot of things on guys. I don't know. It just, a couple times, I don't, it's not a big deal. It's really. It's not.
The only time now you're talking about like me not going to your party because of Jay, and you're right, that was because of him. that was probably...
No, I understood that. I don't care about that. I mean, there's 150 people there, Shelley. I mean, I would have liked you to have been there, but it's not like it was this private, intimate thing.
No, I know.
So not only does Shelley present candidate answers herself, she also admits that Debbie was right. She then makes a similar concession later on when she mentions that the Halloween party that she probably should have attended. So given that the conversation develops in this way, Heritage claim that the speaker's putatively K-plus position cancels the possibility that the utterance will be heard as requesting information does not appear to be grounded in the manifest details of the interaction. So just to summarize, we argue that Heritage in this paper and in the epistemic program that he formulates fails to offer convincing evidence that the epistemic status is fundamental in determining that actions are or are not requests for information. And with the introduction of epistemic status, the question how is social action produced and recognized can't be answered by reference to another question, how is relative knowledge recognized? But if the recognizability of social action depends on the recognizability of relative knowledge, how is the latter question settled? Heritage writes that people generally are treated as knowing more about the relatives, friends, pets, jobs, and hobbies than others, but how are such commonsensical notions put to use? So that's thanks.
You want to address that?
I've not read Heritage's work on this. Does he talk about things like recipient design or the preference for agreement and contiguity, these kinds of things that seem to be doing the same sort of work in Sachs's own writing? Does he say that they're now obsolete? Does he replace them, or does he not mention those?
There's some references, a sentence or two, but it's not like encompassed in this. This is quite much treated as something different or something new, I would say. I'm not sure.
I think it's like the recipient design is mentioned and treated as something sort of vaguely discussed previously, and now you have a specification of what that would mean.
I haven't read all of this, but I have read the 2012 paper, and I've read Jack Sidnell's paper on irrelevance of knowledge, I think is the title of that paper, and a few of the other ones. I haven't had 100 Skype conversations about them, so good on you for undertaking this. But the thing that I've always noticed in this work is that the knowledge statements are of such a banal and inconsequential character that it almost raises, at least in the ones that I've addressed, like the thing arrived today or am I a bad friend? Like these are things that are so thinly on the threshold of what we would treat as being even knowable items within it. Like they're not facts in the way that we would treat within the sociology of knowledge, like a production of a fact in a science laboratory, in a courtroom, and other sorts of venues. And I've wanted to see work like this produced in those types of environments where you actually see negotiations of facts. And does that literature just not exist, or are they focused strictly on these sort of very inconsequential discussions of what things are known or unknown about these sort of very minor conversations between friends about where people are, or where objects are, or who's of what character? Is there anything of substance to this?
I mean, in general, the materials used for these analyses are all taken from previous analysis. Yeah. Like, so it's a worked that has already been done. And so very few cases of transcripts that are fresh and that we haven't seen before.
And I see the institutional imperative to engage in this, right? Like this has currency in sociology. The sociology of knowledge is important again. The science and technology studies is garnering quite a bit of attention again. Right? Like these things are coming, and the need to engage in these debates, I think, is making itself institutionally relevant. But I just don't see this as, but like it's trying to fit a round peg into a square hole.
But just a quick comment there, that the issue doesn't seem to emerge from an interest in knowledge. It emerged from a quite different question. How do we recognize the question as a question? That is the starting point. So the focus of this work is not so much on knowledge. There's actually very little discussion in the papers about what knowledge might be. Because the phenomena that Heritage tried to describe is how do we understand a question as a question. So epistemics become a solution or disambiguated, but it's not because there's an intrinsic interest in knowledge in these papers.
Quick, really, request for clarification. Under the heading is Epistemics Arrival Version, you have these two paragraphs, and then you have Garfinkel, Boston Seminars, 1975. First of all, are these Garfinkel's words? And secondly, who's the speaker in the tape?
The tape is Garfinkel speaking. And that's sort of a rough transcription of that.
That was Garfinkel speaking?
Yes.
Yeah, really? Okay. I see.
But it's part of a 2-hour lecture, so it's just one short moment of that.
I think the way you're doing is spot on, not a problem at all. But in terms of why we're all here today, what's the point of the example, as it were? What's the point of the demonstration?
Yeah, if this is just spanking.
Well, right? Because you just showed us an example of some nice work you guys are doing, but in terms of today's agenda, what's the point?
Yeah.
Maybe my question would be related to that question. I don't know, unless you want to engage directly with.
Believe this work doesn't stop it.
Well, I just wanted to pick on something, or pick up something that you said, that of this excerpt, there's always possibility of a alternative or contradicting analysis. Yes, but in Heritage case, it seems that it seems to be shifting, or kind of the whole basis upon which alternative analyses are to be decided upon. No? And what knowledge means, etc. So that we all know.
We know he's been wrong. Yeah? So just kicking the shit out of him again doesn't really do anything.
But my question didn't go into that sense. It's rather he tries to shift the basis upon which what is to be supposed to be wrong and not wrong is to be decided upon. So maybe you could elaborate a bit more on that, and also upon how Heritage deals the question with respect to the technical thing regarding relevance. No? In relevance in Schlegel, etc., is conversation analysis, an external analysis, and then there's this complaint about what is the first action, but what has he to say on relevance as an analytic kind of issue? So these were.
Okay, yeah, I find it really interesting, your assessment of heritage's, let's call it model. But I was also interested in, I don't think you quite concluded that, whether what he's proposing or his analysis, whether it's a return to something in methodology. Because, I mean, to my view, it's actually a return to something which was being done in artificial intelligence and cognitive science in the 1980s. And I remember, in fact, precisely then, there was a specific model that actually to participate in a conversation, you had slates of epistemic states of the participants and different strategies and models for actually mapping these. So it certainly fits into that partly, and partly also where the questions of relevance arise. The focus on intonation was very much there in early work of Gregory Wilson and Dan Sperber, where actually focus on intonation actually driven which entailments you actually derive from a certain structure. So both of these motives in Heritage's work are actually, well, however they relate to ethnomethodology in the past, they certainly are returned to something which was then subsequently shown unviable because you couldn't actually do it.
Yeah, I completely agree that this is a return to the cognitive science of the 60s, 70s, 80s. And I mean, that field has moved on.
Yeah.
even if you don't agree today with what they're doing. But so it's a very strange return in reviving that. But also in sort of the relevant, what has this to do with the current? I mean, today heritage is one of the most known names in CA, and he has a tremendous impact on what happens. And it's not just CA, it's sort of now with this connection of.
Well, maybe they to say that he returned a little to speech act theory, which was so very politicized, because it's not quite that. But I mean, what he's returning to is why people actually left speech act theory and using that as a model of conversation was its decontextualization. And the fact that you actually had to situate the action in a flow of whatever was happening. And now he comes out of it again.
Well,
it is analysis. Graham first, I think, and Jeff.
Well, I always defer to Jeff.
Thank you. Okay.
but I want next.
For his analysis to get off the ground, he has to have a contrivance, right? And the contrivance is treat these data as ambiguous in some sense, and I'll show you how they could be disambiguated. Right? I think we're hinting at that, you know.
Yeah.
So the whole thing is based upon a contrived version of the materials, rather than on the materials and what they can endogenously show us.
I think I was going to say something similar, which was to answer Andy's question directly. What it's got to do with the topic of gathering is that one of the radical initiatives that Sachs provides is that you provide an account of the materials from within the materials themselves, not from something that stands outside of the materials, like some abstract schema that you then apply on materials, irrespective of what they are. And what these two guys and the rest who've been meetings on Skype, lucky it's not the phone, you know, and the bills entailing. What they've shown, and I think dramatically shown, is that what heritage is doing is relying on something that stands outside of the materials, and therefore is reverting to the ways in which social science normally goes about its business, which is to provide an account in terms of its own professionalised, constructed.
I agree entirely. That's a demonstration of the work. But what's the point of the demonstration? What are we going to take? What's the topic of discussion really? We sit here and talk about this, or it's a bigger issue about Sachs. There's a bigger issue about Ethno and CA. What's the bigger question?
Can I answer that, Andy?
Please do.
I think it's about where you draw lines. Where you draw lines, and how you cluster things on the basis of those lines. And I suspect many of us in the room would be suspicious of some generalised statement that John Heritage might come out with simply on the basis of how long history reading has done. But that's not a reasonable basis for drawing a line and saying Heritage has crossed that line. He's now no longer central to CA or no longer central to Ethno and CA or now we trust those. What I think is being shown here, and it's come up in Graham's summary, is that that's one way you can draw a line. So my answer to Andy's question is, one of the questions that's sitting behind this discussion is, how do we demarcate what is and what is not radical methodology? And one of the ways of doing that is to draw a line, cluster some things. And this is one way you can cluster it. Now there are going to be lots of other ways, and I'm waiting to hear what those other ways are. But drawing lines is what this is about, and saying that's one side of the line, and radical methodology, CA, is the other side of the line. And on drawing that line on the basis of Graham's summary of promoting the scheme for that side. But there must be other ways of doing it, and I'd be interested to hear other ways that might be applied to this paper.
I mean, we were having a bit of a discussion about video analysis, because I think it's not just heritage, it's also video analysis. And the idea it's a temptation. You analogically work from the sorts of work that Sachs was doing, and then you start to get to the business of saying, in this piece of video data, this is what the people are really after all doing. And it's the business of the analyst to see what's really actually happening in a given situation. And again, so it's quite ramified, and it's not just in CA, it's also there's some very good video analysis, but there's also some really terrible stuff, and it's spreading really fast. And if you're in a conference or a workshop setting, you encounter this stuff, and it's unrecognisable from the sorts of work that many of us would think we were doing. So I agree, it is problematic, and it's spreading fast, and I think you end up having fights with people who may have very interesting data, but the way in which they're dealing with this is incredible in all sorts of ways. So in a sense, I think there are lines of demarcation, and they reject attempts to question how they're treating their data as well. So there's
in terms of Bob's answer to I mean, that's just the difference between good CA and bad CA, not radical CA or radical economic methodology. One would count and one wouldn't. Yeah, is what I'm saying. But that's not a radical distinction, is it?
You
I don't know. That's no, I'll have to get people talking about it.
I mean, the topic, it's the puzzle of the line. I mean, if this counts as bad CA. I mean, I think one of the most striking things about it is it's a retreat from sequential analysis and insistence on the coherence of the terms of formal space in the production of action formation. And this, I mean, you're not going to find that in Sachs's lectures. Manny has spoken of it for years. And so I'm saying, I think it's other than bad CA. I think it's a retreat from central conceptualizations. And it's in full flight. I mean, it's a prolific publication regime, I think. So, and I think the lines become multiple. I think you can articulate them in these various ways and tie them directly to the literature of our, our common compass. So it's a bit more than bad CA. It's a retreat from certain premises of conceptual.
I mean, the point I was trying to make there was that it's not the line that's being drawn here is not the one that tells us where radical economic methodology begins, and that seems to be what Bob was saying in response to Andrew.
Maybe in places. I mean, I would take it that the feature of radical ethno is how it is that temporality is constitutive of meaning. And temporalities are wasted in this thing. I mean, temporality is not a circularization. So I think there are places in where it attaches to what could be radical about the rest.
I don't disagree with what Bob said. I think drawing the line about what constitutes a radical study, I think you're saying the same thing. There are some fundamental features of interaction here which is attentive. And when you start disattentive to these things, then you lose the radical phenomenon. That to me makes sense. I think that's what you were saying.
I think I was trying to get at a higher level than that, but it was there are multiple lines to be drawn, and we need to know which ones we're drawing and what the criteria for drawing them are. And this is raised one set of criteria about one line. But those recipients don't agree with it. There are multiple lines, and there will be different criteria. There's the good bad. We are hopeless as a community about good bad. We're very, very, very poor at saying that this is not good work, except in the pub and to ourselves. We are very bad about it. And so we've got an army of stuff out there that we would not recommend to our students, but it's all marching along as if it's a methodology. Where do we draw the line?
One, maybe the same line or slightly different, is that what I take to be fundamental to CA and related to Ethno's agenda is the claim, initially, and I think most articulated in stats, that there is a way to analyze, and there must be a way to analyze because the production of action in its course, the co-production of life, the interactive production of action in its course, is organized
go back to the tapes as they did here. Because this analysis is not just that it crosses a line into something that's other than ethnomethodology, more like regular social science. It fails to characterize the singular instances that are mobilized through collections. And related to the quantification issue is, we didn't really talk about that, it's in the handout, this move to quantify, codify and quantify. Okay, well, people do that in many fields, there's nothing, intrinsically terrible about it. But what are you doing to the claim about the singular case when your authority is a collection? And the collection is composed of fragments that are taken from lots of tapes, arguably equivalent in some sense to one another. But it's the collection and then defines the organizational features of these fragments that are then in published literature. And then you're that much further away from the claims that we made all along in CA and repeatedly for as long as he was writing by Shengov, that the singular case is not the only thing, but that is the demonstrable outcome of the analysis, the test of the analysis, if you like, is the singular case.
Discussion reminds me very much you look in grounded theory, the Lasan's trials and then the big falling out between them, and then one side goes more for the scientific version and the other one does other things. In the end, the problem that we have is that this group is not institutionalized in the way in which the CA that you've just seen has institutional basis all around the world. We are scattered around in computer science department. Whether there will be a longer term development of that, we are unsure, because you point that out in your paper. There might be one or two more generations of us, but as long as we don't have an institutional base where we can grow and from where we can publish, without that and without building a history and building on a history that we have with the boxes, I don't think we can compete with what's coming out of this. Because we can talk as long as we want about them. They will continue publishing and they've got getting academic positions. We won't. Well, at the moment, it's not really.
But I'd like to revert to my point about the radical character of ethno and CA mostly not being recognised. And it seems to me here what we've got is another instance of the extremely general problem that there is no real relationship between the materials that sociologists go to such trouble to collect and the things they say about them. And nobody cares. I mean, that's the point. That's why we look like a bunch of loonies. Look, that's the good one. They don't care. It's the thing they say that's interesting. Yeah, and so Heritage has got his equilibrium model, for God's sake. And he's got a driving force for conversation. I mean, and so nobody really cares that his analyses are really feeble, and that all the interesting bits of analysis are just repetitions of things Harvey Sachs said 50 years ago. I mean, that's the thing. I don't see anything new in this except epistemic tickers and driving forces and action formation problem, which, after all, is really utterance design. And it seemed one of the things struck me about the talk was, of course, the slippage between, not necessarily you, but it's published in literature, slippage between utterance and action. And of course, everybody knows an utterance is not thereby, well, what type of utterance it is doesn't tell you what kind of action it is. So there's absolutely nothing in this. But so the real problem is, and you can't get it to anybody, and I think it's the lowest comment, you can't get people to see that, and this is where, in many ways, Echo started, objectifying the phenomenon. So you could actually, what you said about it would be about the phenomenon. You can't get people to realize that because they don't care. It doesn't matter what the data is. It's important you have some. That's why the world is full of studying ethnographers and qualitative researchers and grounded theorists. And the data's just as crap and just the same and just as badly analysed as it always was. But it's not, we backed off. I mean, it's just like, it's trying to fight a swamp, basically, and it can't be done. So, you know, we're going to, I'm not against them, you know, the interesting thing is like, well, this is what they say, does it fit what they've got? Fascinating, we're spending a lot of our time on, but it's not going to address a problem that hardly anyone else will recognise. And as somebody was suggesting, it'll more be in the context of rocking boats and presenting united fronts to the profession and other irrelevancies to intellectual work. Sorry. Yeah,
what is the radical about this, right? It's something that might have various forms of its expression. In my case, is generating an enormous nostalgia of everything that actually is not in it, and a vivid memory of the early Sachs works, particularly on the question of question itself. For me, his early work consisted of two parts, which is asking a question and then giving an answer. And it seems to me that those who follow Sachs' work put emphasis only on what the answer was and never asked the question how in the world he arrived at that question. And how much actually asking a question was far more fundamental than what the answer was for it. And so it seems to me here there is an urge of these perpetual answers and telling us what explicitly things are, rather than actually posing a right question. Because the question seems to be, at least in the Sachs case, always had a paradigmatic character. So it's not just any question, it is a fundamental question that he's asking. Right? So how in the world somebody will focus on a sentence of a little girl and then ask a question that actually is so relevant on the basis of looking at this such a trivial sentence.
Are you alluding to the baby cry?
Yeah. That is far more fundamental than what, of course, once he gives categories explanation, then you can continue, right? But how can you pose the question of the fundamental relevance as he does remains enigma, right? And therefore, it was so easy with the Shagwell to continue the sort of that type of project without coming back to the origin of actually asking a relevant question. Because I think that was the radical element of Sachs' project. And that's why to keep with questioning as a part of the project was his understanding what he called conversational analysis, which is that you are doing in situ work, then you can ask questions that are pertinent and fundamental for that particular analysis. And in that sense, I am reminded of that part of the missing history in this paper. And just a last comment is that I was just wondering whether your term that he failed to prove actually fits your own analysis, because there's nothing in it that can be proved or disproved, because nothing is there to begin with.
It's more it's presented as presenting evidence for the position, and we're disputing that this is a presentation of evidence.
Right, but then you're playing his game.
Yeah, and we are doing so deliberately. Like all the papers actually are not criticizing this from an ethno or radical ethno point of view. We are mostly using quotations from Shevlov and people within CA, so it's more from that direction that the critique is formulated.
Drawing a line with these.
Why are you not critiquing it from a radical ethno point of view? Is it something dangerous about that? Is there a risk in that?
But it's easier to disregard for a CA people to say that this is just a rabbit.
Our best is not going to listen to you if you put that badge on.
Let me try to. One thing this project's done for me, I'd lapsed out of interest in CA about 20 years ago after taking the tilt at it. And then in the last 4 years or so, I've read more than I care to read of recent CA. And really, it's painful to read sometimes. But that's, you know, not that this is a criticism, exactly. It's very tedious, lots of instances, lots of turgid sorts of things said about it. It's not what you would sit down to read for a blood evening. And read a lot of it, and not too surprised about the way it's drifted, but one thing came out of it, I gained an appreciation of Manny Shadwell's work as, okay, maybe it's not the most radical ethnomethodology we could think of. He made his peace with a kind of structural orientation. He's got his distinctions between analysts and well, between vernacular intelligibility and what an analyst technically should do, and I think that's problematic. However, he hews very closely and persistently to some of these lines that Bob was articulating, and to some extent he may be the only prominently recognized conversation analyst for doing this persistently over the years, as well as arguing against speech act theory, against the imposition or importation of standard sociological variables on the analysis of conversation, is that you can draw them together in a facile way. He's done quite a lot of work on both the analytical and the programmatic level, and I think that within that domain, as it's recognized in literatures, professions, and practices, we're working within the space that Manny occupies, knowing that you can criticize much of what he does too, but in that space, what he's doing is retaining what I would say to be a radical version of ethnomethodological composition analysis. And we're doing it strategically because we want to get to the outlets like Walsey and discourse studies where we're publishing. We want them to take notice of it, because I know damn well from my own work they don't take notice of it if you give a very fundamental critique, and it just goes by them. And you know, they're not going to accept anything. No, they won't answer criticism. They won't accept it, but they have taken notice.
So the takeaway is like, let's drop the nomenclature, radical ethno.
Yeah.
Let's get rid of it. It's going to do none of them is there. And let's all be a bit more strategic and polite about how we tackle this.
No, it's being treated as very impolite.
Yes, no, it does.
It's not the last word, but I think in that domain it's pushing. And as I was saying about Shadwell, he retains enough that it deserves respect for what it is.
Incidentally, I had fun with Heritage too in reenacting one of the first actually excerpt that he had analyzed, and then I submitted a paper, first draft, to one of the journals that was mentioned, and the reception was quite interesting.
Of course, you
Oh, it's just a blunt dismissal of this being utter ethno-jargon of no relevance whatsoever, completely out of place, etc.
Of course, this is
the arguments were pretty much similar.
This stuff is the second program. Let's remember, there was another program that Heritage was the institutional talk program, which goes back 30 years now, which was in a broad sense attempting something very similar, in that it was an attempt to formulate a generalized model of talk that would enable all sorts of talk in all sorts of different settings to be analysed according to a kind of paradigm. And that big for a while. You remember those couple of books, Zimmerman and Bowden, and Heritage and Drew. But was dropped when in favour of this, because the institutional talk programme. Well, I don't know whether this was why they dropped it, but certainly this seems to have taken its place. And I suspect that part of the reason was the fairly damning criticism that the institutional talk programme received. At least I like to think it was, because I was one of the authors.
Yeah.
But so but the point I'm making is that there is a point to criticising this stuff. The institutional talk programme was very, very big for a number of years, but then there's kind of more sunk without trace.
No, it's still there.
Is it still around? Oh well.
But
it's not just John Heritage that there's a problem here. There's those bloody clowns down in Loughborough, right? Or was that on the telephone? who are providing descriptions that they affiliate with CA that stands outside of the very things that CA has articulated in the past, introducing things like cognitive dispositions in terms of gender assignments and the like. So it's not just John Heritage that is causing a problem with the ways in which CA is being taken. There are others, and they need to be addressed just as much as the way in which conversation analysis is going in the hands of John. There are others that also would lay a claim to be able to say what CA is today, and they also need to be hauled up as well. A line needs to be drawn over their work.
We had a couple of slides which we didn't show, but which is on the handout, and for instance, this article by Tanya Stivers on coding. And this is very recognizable as social science, but perhaps not recognizable as CA at all. And she is the one who took the share of the Shegloff, who in a sense lead the way of CA and new CA. And also this Stefanovic and Perekele research center, where you talk about like epistemics interacting with other benefactives, deontics, so building a theory where these different notions are in complex ways, it says, interacting with each other. So it's not persons interacting, it's deontics interacting with epistemics in complex ways. So there seem to be quite, and perhaps these tendencies have existed for long, but there seem to be very prominent persons driving this right now.
Well, Jeff's had a pop at some of them.
Big one.
I said you've had a pop at some of them.
A pop? Oh,
pop.
An attack?
Yes,
yes,
attack.
yes.
Uncharacteristically.
In relation to the Loughborough clowns, obviously the clown school, it is kind of possible to offer critique to them and they respond. Will and I did a few papers responding in Claudette Research where Jonathan and others responded, and responded quite vigorously, and we responded back again. Now, that Jonathan now and Alexa have left Loughborough now in the States. I don't think that's probably not too far a stretch to think that's because of our work, and they got drummed out of that school. But I guess with the kind of epistemics kind of thing is I take it that, okay, so yeah, they're going to do this thing anyway because it's really good, and it kind of like gives CA a way out from stamp collecting in that sense, and that's what they're doing more and more of kind of that sort of detailed studies. But I kind of come back to Andrew's point. It's like, so, okay, well, what is that for us here? Yeah, they're going to do what they do, whatever, and good to critique them, and they might respond to it. I think a special issue in discourse studies is probably the best way of doing that. You're going to get noticed. But that's not going to stop all the CA conferences doing epistemics. And that's not going to stop the rejection from role seeking if you can't sort of offer anything else. But for us here, we've got this room full of people who I respect and admire to talk about ethnomethodology. Okay, so what are we doing here in that sense? What's the itch that you kind of like sort of see as the was kind of interesting in 2010 when CA kind of like dropped the kind of F methodology manual anyway.
There's a lot more to F than CA.
Hmm?
There's a lot more to F than CA.
That's right, yeah. So if we're going to discuss F methodology, what are the issues here with F methodology that we can address or discuss or raise?
I think the other thing we can do is when we ask sort of the relevance of these things, we might also want to frame up the types of risks that we're discussing in relation to partaking in this type of work, particularly two risks that I think one is relevant to the academic setting and one is relevant to outside of the academic setting. The academic setting is who's getting jobs, and their grad students are getting jobs, and they'll tell you and they'll brag about that, and we are not. At least not at the same degree that they are. They're incredibly successful because this looks like conventional social science, but it's passed off as being, it is conventional social science, but it's passed off as being this sort of vague cultural theory, linguistics, maybe even interpretive sociology, these types of things. And that's bullshit. It's not. It's garbage, right? It should be burnt at the stake, if you ask me. Never mind that, because my opinion is that the thing that I think is really disconcerting is there's this new trend of expertise, especially when we look at, like, so the Simon Cole stuff is a nice example of contested expertise in courtroom settings, but now we have things like confession experts who are using stuff that looks a hell of a lot like CA. It's the transcription technique, there's these, and I don't know where they're coming from, but these are PhDs who are making a career now of going into courtrooms and saying so-and-so is guilty or so-and-so is not guilty. And this is huge ramifications on things that when you look at the actual interactions that they're examining, how would you ever make heads or tails of these things as being anything other than what they are in that setting? Yet they're saying authoritatively and definitively in front of people who decide fact from fiction, this is X or this is Y. And that's a huge consequence, not just to sociologists, but people who are sitting in the stand and being accused of something. So yeah, I think these are real risks that are a consequence that we need to address.
Very similar to what Patrick said, I think there's another issue here, which is we're talking about trying to get second edition Holstein, but there isn't a journal that we could publish it and would have a wide readership in the way that they used to. Even studies were somewhere you could have written a piece attacking this kind of approach 20 years ago. Even studies seems to have disappeared. And as things, sorry? Yeah, but it turns to the forum for us to be doing this.
Well, just to intercept a little bit, we could have published these papers that Jonas and Oskar, Doug, and Wendy and others wrote. But we could have gotten them to do the studies. I think they would have been accepted. But we wanted to go into journals that people in CA read. They won't read human studies. It's this part of the problem I think we're seeing this here is that one thing this talk and this session is confronting is the FLCA split. And one thing I'm proposing here is that it doesn't need to be a split. Now, we're never going to convince the people at UCLA or wherever, Loughborough or whatever, that they're going to come around to this. But what this is a reminder is that I think probably most people in this room use recorded, transcribed work, practices, utterances, whatever you want to call it, as part of what we do analytically. It doesn't get recognized as serious analytical work in the way that publications and vaults do within those fields. Maybe elsewhere it does, but they don't touch it, right? And so we're trying to make inroads into that, just to put on record, we're not going to convince them, put on record that there's problems with this stuff, analytically, empirically, however you put it.
I was always saying that, you and I have talked about the latest announcement of the problems.
Yeah.
We both agree that in many respects we're wrong. But actually what you touch upon, and I think whether you agree or not, let's find out, is the idea that you can do the kind of studies that you do to unsettle discourses in social sciences and beyond. So by taking this stuff to CA and not human studies, the question is that the kind of strategy to unsettle their discourses, to unsettle their enterprise, to bring them back?
It's harder to take it to their territory.
Yeah.
So it's not settled.
In in some respects, ethnomethodology is kind of lost or is losing its main foil, right? Because you've got all of these trends in contemporary sociology like postmodernism, post-structuralism, right, stuff like that. Whereas the original set of foils were more circumscribed. The primary one being, of course, structural functionalism. Secondary one may be symbolic interaction. So insofar as it's losing its foil, I think that its primary foil in the contemporary intellectual scene should be psychology. Sociology is now disparate in so many ways. It has lots of internal dissension, critique and stuff, but psychology is primarily, to my mind, a much better, more coherent foil, particularly cognitive science, but also other fields of psychology. So that if we want to use ethno as an attack dog, that would be a good target.
Jeff, from my survey of this kind of discourses, they actually recognize Garfinkel's work far more than
Who's the they?
Like, for example, post-structure.
Yes,
and it's actually in the very radical aspect of ethnomethodology. They, like mentioning Julie Butler and Agnes Peet, right?
Yeah.
So it is. I think that what I can take from this presentation for what would be relevant for us here is to recognize the difference between CA, I would say starting with Sheglow and going all the way to Heritage, is that their success is that they provide a scheme, a mechanism of the analysis that can be endlessly reproduced, which is very, very helpful for the people who build career on producing work. So here is the way in which you actually can build a career. You do that, replicate, which is not the case with ethnomethodology because it is very hard to produce work, right? In a sense in which we expect people to produce radical analysis. So there is no such a thing. There is no instrument that produces endless reproduction. Once you have a turn-taking paper, all you got to do is just do endless details that fit this, but there's no equivalent. And so that is the losing proposition that you have to accept. If you want to be part of this losing project, you have to accept this as a motivation, right? To understand that your work has to start from yourself. That is the, at the same time, curse, but also privilege of radical idiosyncratic analysis. Is that you have to make yourself relevant without any reference to previous mechanisms of reproduction, and therefore we have to sit and wait for a long time before something good comes out. In the meantime, they're going to get positions and jobs and all of these things because they have those mechanisms that we don't have.
On that thrilling note, depressing note, whatever, it's lunchtime.